Okay, so we're continuing to talk about how to graph a parabola, and we've talked previously of how to do it when it's in this standard form, something that might look like this, where there's an a, it's either positive or negative, it's to the second power, and then it continues. And we've talked about stretching and shrinking and so on. I want to show you now how to do it when it's in a different form, where it's not in the standard form of a parabola, but it's in what we call vertex form. Now, we talked briefly about it last video, and I'm going to talk more about it in the next video. But one thing you may observe is that inside the parentheses, there's a minus h in this vertex form into the second power, so it already looks different from the get-go. So let's talk about it right away. It says when h is greater than 1. Another way to say that is when this h is a positive number. When that happens, there's a horizontal translation to the h units to the right. So if this was the parabola and the h was positive, this whole parabola would move to the right however many numbers there are. So if that h was a 3, you take the parent function and you would just scoot this parabola over 3 spots. So 1, 2, 3. But also true is if it's less than 0, or if this h were a negative, you would move it to the left. 1, 2, 3. One thing that sometimes trips people up is that there's already a negative there. It's x minus something, which is h. Ignore the negative for what I'm talking about. You're only looking at the h. If the h is positive, it goes to the right. If the h is negative, it goes to the left. Ignoring this negative, that's part of the vertex form. Okay, so one other thing we should know, the vertex of the graph is h and 0, and the axis of symmetry is h. So let's do some review really quick. Before, when it was in standard form, the axis of symmetry was found by using this formula, negative b over 2a. Now it's telling us when it's in this vertex form, we're no longer using this formula to find the axis of symmetry, that line that divides a parabola in half. We're no longer using that formula of a negative b over 2a. How we're finding the axis of symmetry is simply looking at the h. Whatever the h is, it's even easier. That's the axis of symmetry. Okay? And then it's telling us that, well, how do you find the y part? Well, the y part we'll talk more about next video. It's really simple. But if there's no numbers being added or subtracted at the end of this, the y is 0. And that's what we're going to look at today. So looking at this, you can see that there's no numbers being added after the square. So we already know the y-axis will be 0. So let's look at this one here. It says to graph this quadratic and compare it to the parent function. It wants to see how they're different. So let's go ahead and graph these real quick. See if I can scoot this down a little bit. So let's graph the parent function first. I'm just going to write it in blue here. F of x equals x squared. So one way you can graph the parent function is you can make a chart. You can substitute numbers in. So I'll do like a negative 2, a negative 1, a 0, a 1, and a 2. And we're just going to substitute them in. If you input a negative 2, you would square it, you would get a positive 4. Negative 1 squared would be a positive 1. 0 would be 0, 1, and 4. Okay, so now we just need to graph this parent function. So let's go ahead and do that. If x is a negative 2, 1, 2. Y is a 4, our f of x is 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. If it's a negative 1, it's a positive 1. If it's a 0, it's a 0. And since it's symmetric, whatever I did on one side, I do the exact same thing on the other. You can count from that axis of symmetry, 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay. There's the parent function. This is the thing everything is based off. This is the parabola, the quadratic, that everything else will either be stretching, a vertical stretch, vertical shrink, a translation up, a translation down, or to the left and right. Okay, everything's based on this parent function. So going back to the original question, it says compare this equation to it. So let's now write the other equation on this board here. I'll use a different color marker so we can follow along. G of x equals half the quantity of x minus 4 squared. Okay, so how are we supposed to graph this? Well, we know from our notes that the vertex of this graph is just going to be, the axis of symmetry is just going to be the h value. And the h, if I were to write in standard form, let me just do that real quick. F of x equals a x minus h squared. The h, you can see, is above that 4. So because we know that, we can graph this axis of symmetry that the h is 4. We are no longer using our formula that we've used in the past to find the axis of symmetry, right? We know we're no longer using this because it's in vertex form. It's in this form. So we just, whatever is under the, whatever the h is the axis of symmetry. It's a 4. It's that fast. It's that easy. Okay. And then we were told also that the y value is just 0 if there's no numbers being added to this. There's no numbers being added after the h square here, the x minus h squared. So since there's no numbers being added, it's just 0. So our axis of symmetry is 4, and our vertex is 4 and 0. So let me graph it here. I'll use this black marker. So we start at 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. There you go. Oh, that is not right. What did I do wrong there? Remember, what's being influenced here is the x, not the y. So I shouldn't go up 4. The x goes left or right. And if we look at our notes, when it's x, it translates to the right if it's positive. So that's one common mistake that's often made, is people will go up, they'll go vertically instead of horizontally. So let's get rid of that. And we're going to move since it's a 4, we're going to move positive 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and then to find those other points, we know it's 0, 4 and 0. So we have the vertex. Now to find the other points, really all we did was move this over 4 places. If you could perfectly move your parabola, you'd be done. But since that's not always available to do, we just have to graph it. And how we do that is we just choose any points. We make a t-chart and choose any points. Let's see, let me choose. I don't know. Let me choose 0 and 2. So let's substitute it in for the x. So we're going to take 0 and 2, substitute it in here. Let's start with the 0 first. So g of 0 equals half of 0 minus 4 squared. G of 0 equals half. 0 minus 4 is just a negative 4 squared. A negative 4 squared would be 16, and half times 16, remember you multiply by the top and divide by the bottom, would equal 8. So if I input a 0, my output would be an 8. Let's do the same thing with the 2. Maybe we can do some of this in our head. Well, let's just do it. Let's just do it. So g of 2 equals half 2 minus 4 squared. 2 minus 4 would be a negative 2. If you square that, you would have a positive 4. And half of 4 multiplied by the top, you have a 4 divided by 2 would be 2. So if you input a 2, your output would also be a 2. Okay, so let's graph these real quick. If x is 0, the g of x would be an 8. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, way up here. If x were a 2, y would be a 2. So we have half the parabola right here. How do we get the other half? Remember, it's symmetric. The axis of symmetry divides us all into half. So whatever's on one side, the exact same thing will be on the other. So if I go up 2, I'm 2 away to the left. So if I go up 2, it'd also be 2 away on the right, because it's symmetric. If I go up, if I go over 1, 2, 3, 4, I go up 8. So I can go over 4. And I'll go up 8. Because it's symmetric. So there you have it. There's your parabola. There's the 2.